Hello everybody, James Rink here. It is July 11th, 2017, and I have Kevan Trimmel with me. And Kevan is a SSP experiencer. He was a Empath and remote viewer for the Secret Space program. He did work, I believe you said Solar Warden. I don't know, Kevan. That's all I have on your bio. So why don't you go ahead and jump in and give us a little bit more background information about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, James. Yeah, I was picked up when I was 19 years old by a TR-3B in broad daylight, and this occurred in a forest close to where I live in Cambridge, Ontario. And I was bicycling along, and it was a sun and cloud day around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Got off my bicycle for a break. And it became dark overhead, and I assumed a cloud had just blocked out the sun. So I looked up, and right over me was the TR-3B. This is the smaller white TR-3B that's used by the Canadian Forces, and it is man-made, and it has paneling on it. You could see the paneling on it, and it was grayish white, and I think it's about half the size of the black triangles, and it was like right over the treetop, so only a couple hundred feet off the ground. And I walked underneath it for 4 or 5 minutes. That's how slow it was moving. I was able to walk underneath it, walking my bicycle to the end of the trail to where it opened up into a field. And then I was kind of in shock, so I just sat down, and as I sat down there, the craft just slowly started to gain altitude and disappeared into the clouds. And so I was sitting there in the field in shock, and it wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I started having flashback memories in the form of dreams, vivid dreaming, and that involves memories that I feel have to do with the SSP, which I can get into now because the reason why I wanted to reach out to you, I do have memories involving Michael Prince, James Casbolt. And in terms of my timeline, it may actually add up because I got picked up in November 2008, and I think Michael was fairly active around that time. And my memories of him are we're flying in the TR-3B, and we're sitting there, and they got these seats that kind of pull out from the wall, and they got straps, and you're sitting there facing each other on the sides. And I remember looking over at a screen where the cockpit was, and there was, instead of a window, it was more of an interactive screen, and there was a person standing there in a black coat and blue jeans, and he was just standing there in a field talking on a cell phone. And as a remote viewer, because I knew that we were over top of this guy, and I could just see his image on the screen, at that point, I remote influenced and actually zoomed up on the guy from above, zoomed up on him, and it was James, or Michael Prince, talking on his cell phone, and he didn't he looked up and he saw the craft, but he didn't seem surprised. He was just he was talking on his phone. He looked up, it was there, and then that's just where the memory stops. I do have another memory at the LOC later on, and we had been dropped off in a hangar, and I think this is when I was training. I was a cadet, and we got lined up in a corridor away from the hangar. When we first came in, they lined us up in a corridor. We were just waiting there, but as we were filing out of the hangar, I looked back, and there was Michael Prince again standing by the craft, but instead of wearing his civilian clothes, the black leather jacket was gone. He was in a dark, like teal colored jumpsuit, and like an Air Force looking jumpsuit, zipped up over his clothing, and he was just standing there, really casual, talking with another guy who I think was one of the pilots, and they were having a very casual conversation, and their backs were kind of turned to me. So I just looked over, saw them chatting, and then paid attention to what I was doing, getting lined up, and that's actually really the only two memories I have of James, just to get that out there. Or Michael Prince, rather. I also want to talk about the cloning aspect as well, unless you have any more questions.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Now, Kevin, one thing I want to mention here is TR3Bs have not been used since the 1970s. Now they're on the G series. Do you happen to have any information on what those crafts were actually called? Do you recall that, or just remember a delta? I'm assuming it was a delta-shaped craft because that's what they look like. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. One thing about Canada is we get a lot of the hand-me-downs from the U.S. and the U.K. And it basically the TR3B, I've looked into it, the smaller white one, it may be the Aurora class, because I think there's the TR3B Astra, which is the black one, and then you got the Aurora, and that appears to be a smaller version. They were, you're absolutely right, they were used in the 70s, and then Solar Warden was created in the late 70s, early 80s, and I think they inherited a lot of those craft, and they were using them in active service. At least the faction that I was involved with, as of 2008, when I was picked up, it was that older style craft, and then I had 3 more sightings at night, and I actually was able to get a picture off of the small white triangle, and that was in 2015. So that's recent, 2015, and then it flew over my house again in 2016. So again, this has to do with the older style craft of Solar Warden, and what they really do, which is to patrol our airspace, especially between the Moon and Mars, and the Moon and the Earth, and they don't require superluminal capabilities for what they're doing. They are still very fast craft. You know, I'm not sure how fast exactly, but you know, it can make it around the Earth in a couple minutes, I think. I mean, it's still very fast, just not superluminal. At least not that style of craft. But
and superluminal is between different solar systems.
Yeah, like jumping from solar system to solar system or galaxy to galaxy. So, yeah.
All right. So now, why don't you talk a little bit about your military background, or I guess you didn't have a military background. So how did this all begin for you?
It began, I would say, leading up prior to being picked up when I was 19 for about a year. I had been starting to wake up. I really got into monoatomics and alchemy, and I was basically starting to unplug and just go out to the forest and meditate. And I was doing a lot of cleansing and monoatomics and meditation type work. And so I was opening myself up spiritually. And then all of a sudden, the craft appeared above me, like I described, because I'd go to the forest, whether it was just to meditate or go on a bicycle ride. It was meant to kind of get away from the grid and actually reconnect with nature and open myself up a little bit. So I think I just opened myself up, but also the monoatomic side of things, that's an amplifier in terms of psychic ability. So it's not just about reading about meditation and doing the energy work in that. You actually have to fuel that. You actually have to feed your light body in a very real way. You can't just go through the motions of doing Tai Chi and not actually consume enough superconductive substances. Ormus is a superconductor, causes your cells to superconduct. So basically, it's an amplifier of consciousness, and it really does induce astral travel, telepathy, all the psychic abilities. It enhances it. So I was actively on the ascension alchemy path, and so I think that's why, even though I was selected right before my 20th birthday, I was still a candidate in terms of being an empath, which is an auxiliary force. That's not serving in the front lines. I'm not a military combat specialist. I'm not a super soldier in the full sense of the word. I was used as an empath, and then when I went through the training, and they had us do monoatomics, and then they had us do this qigong chi type training. I have a memory with Elena, and she was one of the instructors that Solar Warden didn't have the personnel to train everybody, so they would actually facilitate, or the ICC would facilitate training for Solar Warden. So Solar Warden would loan out its assets to the ICC. The ICC You'd be trained on Mars, and then you would be brought back and once you were trained and serve with Solar Warden. But Solar Warden didn't really train you. It was the ICC groups that trained you. And they divided us into different blood groups. The rhesus negatives were the assassin super soldier types that usually were already in the military or were going to be used in the front lines as an actual soldier warrior type. And then the amino positive, the positive blood types. This has to do with endurance levels and how oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Rhesus negative absorbs much more oxygen much more quickly. That's why they're so explosive, and they have a lot of the psi abilities in terms of actually being able to levitate and direct energy. Anthony Zender, I think, is a Rhesus negative, and just look at his fighting career. Hits hard and fast like a scorpion, and but I think is aware that he can't come at someone that intensely and sustain that for longer than a couple minutes. You get tired very quickly, even as a professional fighter or soldier. But during that small window of when they're explosive, the rhesus negatives, if they have psi abilities and if they're a starseed and they can tap into that side of them, they're incredibly explosive. I wouldn't be surprised if Michael Prince is a rhesus negative as well, just based on his a military type, like Anthony. And Anthony, in the absence of James, and then with Max Spears passing away, I think right now Anthony Zender, in terms of being a super soldier, I think he's really an authentic person to look into in terms of actually being a super soldier. But in terms of me and what I was used for, the O positives, we absorb less oxygen into our blood, so we're not explosive, but we have this stamina and endurance that goes on and on and on. We can stay up for days and days at a time. And this is used, we're used as medics and auxiliary forces, communications, but also remote viewing and empathic abilities as well. So that's what I was used for.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that with us. Yeah, so why don't you explain a little bit more about this battle that took place in 2011 with these reptilians and the different ICC groups, Solar Warden and Dark Fleet?
Sure.
That.
Yeah. That's a shared memory I have with Elena. I not only remember her as an instructor, but this would have been a few years later. There was this incident involving a reptilian armada, a fleet, and I'm not sure which, in terms of the Draco Alliance, I'm not sure which reptilian group it was, whether it was actually the Alpha Draconans or one of the reptilian subspecies. But anyway, what happened was they came into our solar system, this reptilian fleet. They attacked one of the colonies on Mars in the northern hemisphere. I believe it was one of the ICC colonies. And the Nordics that back up Solar Warden, Solar Warden was expected to actually meet these guys head on and defend the planet if these reptilians were going to move away from Mars and actually go towards the Earth. And what was happening was they moved between the Earth and Mars. They cloaked, and they were sending out scouting parties, these little swarms of ships. I'm not sure if they were drones or actually piloted by reptilians or not, but these little swarms of ships were going out and actually coming into our airspace or getting uncomfortably close to the Earth. And Solar Warden, with the help of the Nordic craft, and this is what Elena was doing, she was serving on a Nordic craft, doing communications, relaying the telemetry of these ships coming in between the different craft, and they were monitoring them, tracking them, making it known that these swarms were being monitored and that they were under observance, and they weren't going to be permitted to actually land on the planet. However, Solar Warden at the time, they do have older craft. They are meant to police the solar system, especially the inner solar system, and protect our airspace. And because of that, their craft only had near light speeds at that time, and they were in need of upgrades. So in order to deal with this reptilian fleet, because the reptilians have massive ships, and even their massive motherships can jump from solar system to solar system, galaxy to galaxy. So in order to keep up, Solar Warden made this plea to the ICC group saying, we desperately need some upgrades to deal with this conflict should the reptilians actually try to invade. And I guess at first, even though the ICC, one of their groups had been attacked, at first they weren't really forthcoming because they don't like sharing tech. The ICC groups are very competitive with each other. You got at least 30 different groups, and they're all funded by private interests. And just like in the tech sector, you don't share your the latest software or hardware or whatever with your competitor. And it's still very competitive in terms of the ICC group being at the interplanetary corporate conglomerate. And so it wasn't until the Nordics stepped in and held this conference, and that's where my memory comes into it. I remember being at the conference, and there was the Ashtar-looking guy, the blonde Nordic guy, and Elena does remember him as Ashtar, and that's just one of the Nordic groups. And there was this conference, and I was there to listen and observe and just feel out the Nordics, talking with the Solar Warden personnel about these upgrades. And as well, there's some ICC people present, and it was basically just a meeting. And long story short, they once the Nordics pushed through the upgrades, the reptilians backed off. Once it became clear that we weren't going to be caught off guard, and we were going to fight. And once we made our intention clear that we were actually going to fight, they backed off. And that's basically it. Yeah.
All right. Now, you mentioned that the Solar Warden was controlled by the Rothschilds.
Yeah, in this interview, sure. Before we started recording, we were talking a little bit, and I am going to say it in this interview because it'll probably start to sink in a little bit for people when they understand why Solar Warden was willing to defend the Earth from the Draco. Because when you research this stuff, you find out that we are under Draco mind control, and our planet is under control. So why would the Draco be invading if they're already in control of the planet? Well, they're not completely. There's different factions, and the Solar Warden faction, they are basically run by the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds, in tracing it back, they are the Ra-Kam family from ancient Egypt. Ra means, the sun god Ra, as in Ra-Marduk, and that was an Assyrian Anunnaki ET from the past that basically, when the Anunnaki had their presence in Egypt, he made the Ra-Kam family. Kam means shield, so Ra, shield, Rothschild family. They were the administrators of the empire, and what was meant by that is they controlled the surface, the human population, because they were a priesthood family from Egypt and probably further back than Egypt. But at least we know that in ancient Egypt, you had the Ra-Kam family, the Rothschild family, Rothschild, and they were appointed by Amun-Ra, Ra-Marduk, to the empire, and they still are. And that has to do with controlling secular humanism and us. So the reason why they were willing to fight this reptilian fleet was because they were protecting secular humanism as a commodity, as a workforce, because they don't want disclosure, because they will lose control of the surface in terms of the way things are now. They want the status quo to remain the same, because this has been a very profitable experience for them, being mid-level managers of the planet since Egyptian times. And they don't want to give up their power. There is a changeover that's happening between Orion and Sirius. The Sirian Anunnaki have been in control of our planet for a millennia, and they're basically back to at least the time period I was talking about with Amun-Ra in Egypt, and they don't want to give that up. And apparently, the Draco Orion block, they want the planet back, and this might have to do with the barrier around the solar system right now. But the question is, just because there's this barrier, and just because Solar Warden is willing to defend our airspace, it doesn't mean that they're actually trying to save humanity and defend us like in a movie, like some brave thing, that they're actually trying to defend us from an invasion. They want to remain in control. They know that if this changeover happens, they're going to lose control. They have to give up the reins of the planet. And with all the technology they have, they're not really prepared to do that. So they're entrenching themselves and digging in. And in this conflict, even though they had to get the Nordics to back them up and just to get the ICC groups to hand over a lot of the tech that they were developing in secret, especially on Mars, that event made it very clear that the powers that be do not want this changeover to happen, and they are against disclosure, because if we become a spacefaring civilization and we have full disclosure, then that workforce is not going to be a primitive worker, simple workforce any longer. It's going to be a lot more open in terms of open society. They won't have the same level of control.
So how do you think we'll actually switch over to get out of the control of the Solar Warden groups? Humanity, that is. Or do you think we're just destined to always be slaves? What's your thoughts on that?
That's a good thing to go into. I don't think it's our destiny to be slaves. The greatest secret is the potential of our DNA, and this just goes back to why I showed up on the radar in the first place. And anyone can do this. If you feed your light body, especially with monoatomics, and you do the cleansing, and you wake up and you become aware, and you basically you separate yourself from secular humanism, and you're one that can see. You are at that point a psychic asset. You might be used. You might be approached and used in the program. If you wake up too fast and you have these abilities, they might scoop you up pretty quick. But that's actually an indication, because I'm not royalty. I'm not from a bloodline. I'm not from some secret society, and I also wasn't in the military, and I wasn't groomed as a kid. I'm just a 19-year-old guy that is doing some serious meditation work and cleansing while reading some David Icke. Waking up slowly to this stuff. Still hadn't figured out the ET component really, but I was waking up to the powers that be and the control systems out there, and I just, I was trying to have my my little awakening experience, and I was, and then next thing you know, the craft is flying overhead, and they're on me, and now I'm actually what I've done with that, and anyone can do this, is it's third density striving towards fourth density. Third and fourth density occupy the same space, which is here, the physical. And but being a fourth density being in 3D space means that you're fully awake and aware, and you have all your abilities and all your memories. You're fully integrated. And what they've done is there's this internal hack where they've divided our lower self and our higher self, and the attack is on the human heart. And that's what we're seeing in our society, where they really want us to focus on our lower selves and on ourselves, but the lower self, the survival dynamics, and they really count on the fact that we're going to always be in survival mode and fight amongst ourselves and be selfish in that way. And that's that hack, because what happens is if you're always focused on your lower self and you get caught in the pleasure trap, especially, then what happens with that is you don't integrate and connect with your higher self, and your higher self can be hijacked, and you can be used energetically without being realized or fed upon. This is where a lot of the entity attachments and implants come from, where people have, they'll be so shut down spiritually and I just got to survive, and they're at such a low frequency that pretty much what's left of their energy is being fed upon by a lot of the astral, trans-dimensional astral parasites. And that's perfect. That serves Solar Warden and the Rothschild group perfectly, because then they have this workforce that is being used as slaves in terms of always being caught in their lower self, but they have this potential, and that's what I'm getting back to. We have this DNA potential. We got the combined DNA of 22 different extraterrestrial races, and every person, I've noticed this, will have what I call a prevalent starseed DNA. So we all have the 22 types, and 98% of us is the primate. So 98% off the bat is like we are Homo erectus, very much so still. And the missing link is all this alien DNA that supplemented that and augmented that, and that's where you get the Homo sapien from. But the solution to all this, or to answer your question, the solution to all this is we have to evolve into Homo illuminus, the next stage. And I think originally we were probably meant to go from Homo erectus into Homo illuminus if we had been left alone naturally. We probably would have just stepped into that naturally and evolved into a benevolent, telepathic race. But we've been messed with because of the 22 programs, so much so that the missing link is the hack. It is the genetic manipulation, and so in order to, I guess, fight back against the reptilian agenda and not be a slave is to unlock your DNA potential and actually become homo luminous, and that's how you would fight back.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. Now, I was just wondering, why would the Nordics want to help the Solar Warden, which is controlled by the Rothschilds, when the Nordics were the ones that were backing the Nazis?
Good point. There's a couple of different Nordic groups. There's a renegade Palladian group from Aldebaran on the Orion-Palladian border that actually helped the Nazis, and James Casbolt, Michael Prince, he was associated with that group when he grew up in the Nazi facility, the Q552 in Nelson, in Canada, in the Rocky Mountains. That was a Nazi base, and Fourth Reich, and that was backed by this Aldebaran group, which has connections to the Draco, and that's where the whole Dark Fleet thing comes from. But on the flip side, you also have in the Pleiades as well from ERA the Billy Meyer group of Pleiarans that contacted Billy Meyer, and they seem to be more benevolent. I mean, they're fourth density beings. They're still physical. They still have karma and still live in duality. So they're not ascended beings. They're kind of mid-level beings, but they seem to leave us alone. In terms of honoring the Prime Directive, the Pleiaran group honors the Prime Directive, whereas you have this Aldebaran group, and they look identical. I mean, it's just a different faction within this Nordic group, and so they look identical. They're from the same place, but they're doing two very different things in terms of their society. So there's different factions within the Nordics as well.
Right. Now, I did a regression with James Casbolt, Michael Prince, back in 2013, and in this particular regression we explored this memory where there was a battle with a certain group of reptilian shapeshifters, and apparently he had his own ship, starship Calopia, I believe it was called, Calopia, and he said that I had my own spaceship and we all turned into super soldiers, whereas I guess they shapeshift us and put us in some kind of Nazi-looking uniforms, and us and a group of other super soldiers were sent off to do some battle on the spaceship. Now, that sort of lines up with what you're saying, but I guess that group, it was more than just Solar Warden that was part of this. It was a whole pretty much all the ICC groups were involved in this operation, I'm assuming, is what you're getting at here.
It gets really complicated with the ICC groups because there's the overlap between, you got the Dark Fleet and Solar Warden, and the overlap occurs within the ICC groups because they're facilitating for both factions, kind of playing both sides, and this is basically what happened after World War II. Is the Fourth Reich went underground to Antarctica and South America, and they blackmailed the U.S. and said, we need to use your infrastructure. We actually need your military-industrial complex to build out what we need. We got all the specs and we got the gold. We just need the factories and the workers and skilled laborers and all that. So the ICC groups in America, they just wanted to make a ton of money, and they had no problem secretly helping the Nazis in the late 40s and early 50s because everyone thought they were gone, they were defeated. So talk about a perfect crime, helping the Fourth Reich, which technically doesn't exist if the Germans, lost the war. And I mean, the German army lost the war, but the people behind the Third Reich in the intelligence community, they continued their work and went underground. And I mean, just look at in America, you got the military-industrial complex, even something like the Dulce base, and it's all underground. And so, like, that's what they literally mean. Like, the Nazis are literally went underground, and basically the ICC groups in America, they did sell us out in order to do business with the Nazis in secret, and they made a ton of money off that. And then the Rothschild faction, which is basically, it's a communistic faction. Like if you want to look at this politically, you have a communistic faction of the Illuminati, and then you have the Fourth Reich aspect. And in North America, we actually live under communism, very much so. I know there's the Red Scare in the 50s, and they were trying to make it seem like America was very anti-communism, but in reality, in terms of how their military is run and just our society in general, it is actually still very socialist, and we are on the surface living under a form of communism, and that which would become very obvious very quickly if the Fourth Reich were actually in control of the surface. You would see the difference between the society we have now, which is actually more communistic, and if the Fourth Reich was on the surface like they were when they were the Third Reich. I mean, there would be quite a difference. You could see it. But something I wanted to talk about having to do with the cloning, if that's okay. The cloning aspect to all this.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Basically, and it can work in different ways. What I'm trying to say about this is you can be used in the SSP in different ways. So if you're trying to fill in some memories that you have, this is something I've learned. When you hear someone talk, if something resonates, that's great. But there's obviously going to be things that don't resonate in terms of your own experience if you're comparing your experience with someone else's. And this is such a complex subject, and people are being used in different ways. I mean, if you got the Dark Fleet faction, Solar Warden faction, and then at least 30 other ICC group factions, they all have their own agendas and programs running. So, like Michael Prince talked about. And he was in the military, and he's more of a military guy. And he talked about actually getting picked up and serving like his original self. Like his original self was serving out in space, and a clone was put in his place. And for me personally, when I was recalling my stuff, that's something that was a little out of phase with my own experience, because I feel like the original you see now, I have been here 99% of the time. And when the craft flew over me the first time in November of 2008, that's actually the original abduction experience where I was picked up and they got the genetic sample for cloning, and I was put back within, I think it's within that 5 minutes of me walking under the craft, and then I sit back down in shock. That could have been when they quickly grabbed me and blank slated that. And but it started to come back a couple weeks later. But initially, I was just in shock. I had no idea what happened. So that's an example of when they would grab someone, probably from like the civilian population, if they have a gift, and they'll clone that person. And then now that person is still a part of civilian life, but using soul catcher technology, they can just grab the original consciousness and then use you for your gifts. But you're still a part of regular society in your day-to-day life. Whereas someone like Michael Prince, he is a military guy, and he was, actually serving with the UK forces, and then transferred to America. Did a year with them in America, I believe. So, that's someone who's actively in the military. So he might be someone who actually got picked up. The original got picked up, but he does talk about having a clone taking his place. So it can. What I'm trying to say is it can work both ways. So. Whether you think that you've been in outer space 99% of the time, your clone took your place, or vice versa, don't just grab onto one and then try to, use that to disprove others. It's so complex, and people are being used in so many different ways with all the different programs running out there. It's really just about pulling what resonates for you so you can help to validate your own experience. But just because you're certain of how it happened for you, it can happen in multiple ways for other people. I just want to make that clear, especially I did an interview with Denny Hunt recently, and I did talk about James Casbolt briefly, and about the cloning aspect and his clone being put in his place. And I just wanted to make it clear that I don't doubt that. I don't doubt his experience. His clone could have taken his place, and he could have been the one up in space. It can work both ways. So I just want to make that clear. But it is a good way of trying to figure out how you were used. Are you actually getting picked up physically in the craft, and you're serving as a willing participant, or at least your original self is serving, and they may use drugs and trauma to mind control you when they physically abduct you? Or did they just make a clone, and it's your clone that's serving in the SSP, and they just kind of pull you into your clone body whenever they need your consciousness. So it can work both ways. And then there's also the time travel aspect, which I don't want to get into now because I don't think that really relates to my experience. It doesn't. I know time travel technology exists, and they developed that Project Pegasus. Andrew Bashago talks about the teleportation program, and they kind of accidentally came across time travel technology when they were developing teleportation in the 50s and 60s. And so, time travel does exist. So at the same time, too, if the cloning thing doesn't resonate with you at all, maybe, but you still have the SSP memories and missing time in that, then look into the time travel aspect, because then that can maybe that was the program you're involved in. There's so many different programs. So I just want to make that clear that in order, like, you won't be able to just, you won't be able to research all this stuff and look at every speaker, and it won't line up 100% with your experience because of how vast this is.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for sharing that. Now, I was just curious, as far as well, first of all, I want to explain something here. So, some people have claimed that they had these 20-year back missions where they were spent 20 years on Mars and re-aged and sent back. Now, you're suggesting that it's possible they could just take a clone of them, and the clone spent 20 years, or maybe, or multiple versions, 20 years. So, now I was also told that these clones, the memories would be separate than the original host. So, how do you think it's possible that the memories of these clone experiences, considering that your own fragment of your consciousness is animating this clone, would that also return back to the original host, or would they always be separated? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, I have been thinking about that. I think if they make a perfect copy of you, that also means they're going to clone your pineal gland, and your pineal gland is going to be an exact copy, and it'll almost be like two tuning forks that are in tune. There'll be like this non-local connection, like two Wi-Fi signals, and so you would have this like remote connection, I think, due to the pineal gland, and always be kind of resonating with your clone, but you won't be conscious of it. There'll be more of an energy connection, consciousness connection between you and your clone due to cloning the pineal gland. So if you have the same pineal gland, then there can always be thought transfer between you two telepathically. And that's something I've really been thinking about, because maybe my clone is serving in the SSP still, and all the memories I'm having is actually, the bleed through memories is actually coming from the clone, and you know what I mean. So I could actually just exactly what you said. Like, I could just be experiencing a thought transfer between me and my clone, who is still up there serving, possibly. So that's a definite possibility to look into for people who really feel like they're experiencing this stuff in the astral at night, and it's getting to the point where like they're undeniably having this vivid out of body experiences, and they're SSP related experiences. So there's military and ETs around you, and you're serving in some capacity, but this is happening at night, and then you wake up and you're back in your daily life. So that's something to look into, is if you have a clone with a copy, there could be a thought transfer and bleed through of memories, and you could actually be communicating telepathically with your clone via the subconscious.
Right. Now, can you comment a little bit more about how you actually got your memories back? Because I know you said it began a few weeks after your abduction, I believe in November of 2008. So what happened? Did you use DMT, or did you get hit by a car, or were you meditating, or what happened? A little bird.
I was continuing to meditate. A little bird. No, little birds. But yeah. So after seeing the craft, about 3 weeks later, I started, because I did continue to meditate. I was meditating, and I continued the monoatomics as I was doing prior. And I'd been going really well up until that point in terms of healing. And then this craft flies over me, and a couple weeks later, I start having basically night terrors, like nightmares. And the dreams were exactly what I just described, where there's all these military people around me, and I'm serving with the SSP. And I was never in the military, and I'm not a military kind of person. So it was these recurring dreams, which I feel like are memories now, of these events involving ETs in the military. And that's when I did start looking into the Milab abduction stuff, because it seemed to make sense to me. But I couldn't really make sense of it at first. I was more like just really intense, vivid dreaming and astral experiences at night, and I didn't really understand why. And then I was starting to put it together, and it really wasn't until the craft flew over me a second time at night in 2015. So up until that point, I mean, I had come across James Casbolt's information, and I was following the super soldier topic, and I'd seen some of your videos, and I really enjoyed when Alara and yourself and Max and James, everyone was speaking out about the super soldier topic, because I was having those kind of dreams, but I wasn't really I wasn't really sure what to make of it until in 2015, and this is when I actually was able to get a picture off. It is a blurry cell phone picture, but at least for my own sake, I know that the craft flew over my house again, and then it really sunk in at that moment, because I had been following the super soldier topic when I started researching the Milab stuff, but I wasn't really sure how this would apply to me, and there's some deniability there. There's a little bit of plausible deniability there, because the craft flew over me in 2008, and now it's 2015. And I haven't seen it since. So I've just been researching this stuff, and I got the dreams, and I didn't know what to make of it. And then the craft flies over my house at exactly 3:45 a.m., flies over, and then at 4 a.m., it flies back, like the same way, but it comes right back. And then I thought to myself, I'm like, I wonder if it's going to come back the next night. And if so, I'm going to stay up till 3:45 a.m. again and see if it comes back. And sure enough, it did. And this is last week of March in 2015, and so it flies over on the second night, and I admit, when it came back, I got really freaked out. I was shaking, and I was scared, and when I saw it go over the backyard, there was a sliding door, and I was watching it through the glass, and I know a house can't really protect you, especially from that, but it's hard to describe, but in that moment, I was so afraid of this thing coming back, and I was watching it through the sliding glass door, and I didn't even want to step outside because I was that afraid. And then as it was flying over the yard, I thought, okay, I worked up the courage. I'm going to try to take a picture. So I opened up the sliding door, I ran out on the back steps, and my hands are shaking, like with the camera, right? And I'm like, and I was able to just get one little picture off that wasn't too like blurry, and it's actually pretty clear considering how much I was shaking and how fast this happened. I got one picture off, came back into the house, and then I would say in 2015, that's when it really sunk in, because they came back, and that's what freaked me out, is they came back like that, and which it was my own confirmation. That's what I'm trying to say. It was my own, when they came back, and I got the picture, and yeah, it all kind of sank in at that point.
Well, do you think you did another 20 years and back when they came back?
I don't know. When it showed up, I was meditating at like 3 a.m. In the dark, and then all of a sudden the backyard lights up, and I look out, and then there's the triangle again. So once again, I had opened myself up, and I'm not sure. In terms of my memory, I don't remember being abducted or anything. I just remember it flying over. But it's possible they could have grabbed me again then and blank slated me. I'm not sure. Yeah.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about how they actually capture the souls that they put in these clone bodies? Do you recall what the tech might have looked like, or the process involved? Do you have any memories of that?
My memories are pretty basic. I am not a left brain kind of scientist person. I'm not very analytical. I'm a feeling, intuitive kind of person. So not being a scientist, I can't go too much into the science. But I do recall, just on my visual memory of what I can recall, is they definitely have you lying on a table, and the table lights up. It reminds me of like a scanner, like a printer scanner. But the whole bed's like that, and it lights up, and it keeps track of all your vitals, but it can also scan you. It can literally scan your cells and get a genetic copy. They have these screens with synthetic telepathy, where the doctor can be asking you medical questions or any kind of questions, and your thoughts, as you're thinking them, actually come up on the screen. So it's like, it's not just like a lie detector test with the yes or no's. It's imagine if I ask you a question and you're thinking about the answer, and I can just read like a, you know what I mean, like the text on the screen of what you're saying. So they can read you like a book, literally. And that, I just remember that kind of tech and I think this was at the LOC. They had me on the table. They were scanning me, and then they had the synthetic telepathy. They were, the doctor was could read my thoughts off the screen. So I mean, when they can read what you're thinking and they can scan your every cell in your body, I mean, they can really make a really good copy of you, and they can record that and then holographically, and then they can take the genetic sample and grow you in a test tube and age accelerate you if need be, just like age regression. You can age accelerate someone as well, and they could probably have a clone in a couple of months that's walking, talking exactly your age, and it has all your mannerisms, thoughts, and feelings. Basically, it's just, but it's missing that little spark of source. It's not quite the same.
Right, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, can you talk a little bit more about what your interactions were with James Casbolt? I mean, did you actually get to talk to him? Did he tell you anything?
Sure. I don't no, I don't remember like having conversations with him or anything. I think we were literally picking him up like on the way to the LOC, and he was brought aboard, and when they put you in the craft, no one's talking. Like when you're in the craft, like you're in a trance. You are in a trance. So he gets on the craft. I thought it was interesting that he was talking on a cell phone before then, and you know, in terms of his body language, more natural. And he looked at it, like, okay, it's here. And but then on the craft, you're just strapped in the chair, and they must give you a drug or well, actually, I feel it's more an artificial intelligence that's running the SSP, and it's actually a form of AI entrainment. Although I think drugs can help facilitate that, can get people in a suggestible state, and then the entrainment works really, really well once you're in that kind of state from the drugs. But yeah, he was strapped in. We were all strapped in, and then the memory just ends. And then, like I said, we were shown out of the craft. We were lined up in a corridor, and I just looked back and I saw him standing there talking to the pilot. I couldn't hear what they were talking about. He was quite a ways away. And I just thought it was worth mentioning, though, that I actually do have those memories of him, as brief as the memory is, because when I came across his story, I did recognize him. That's the thing. Like when James, when first time I saw him on camera and he was talking, I mean, he seemed really familiar. And then I listened to his whole story and I followed it as it was progressing. And I think he was messed with. And I think what happened was he defected, and he was because if you go back and you look at his case, he grows up in the orphanage at the Q55 facility in Nelson, and that's a Fourth Reich facility. He gets rescued and brought to Toronto, Canada, and they find in these children all these cybernetics, and this has to do with transhumanism and the Fourth Reich and the AI. And they were basically prepping these 42 children and for the SSP. I think they were prepping them to physically be a cyborg in the Fourth Reich, and then that got stopped. And when he was brought to Toronto, they tried to remove most of it, the nanotech. And I think that's an interesting point, because it has to do with this defection that occurred, because from there he was brought over to the UK, put into the Casbolt family, which was a foster family with MI5 connections, British intelligence connections. He was put into their care, but he was still groomed and prepped. But he had to be a super soldier. He did a couple live operations actually as a kid. And then as an adult, he actually joins the real military and actually serves with the British military. And so I think that's when he went to the Solar Warden side of things. But then if you see the progression of his story, right around the time he meets Haley and Hank Meyer, I mean, that I believe he married into a Jewish family, the Meyer family in America, which that's a perfect example of an ICC group that, you know, like Hank Meyer. I mean, that is a perfect example of someone who would be in charge of one of the ICC groups, and he would be like one of the 30. So inner circle type of person, based on James's background and his record. If that ICC group was affiliated with Solar Warden, which it probably was, if you think about it, James was basically rescued by that faction, and then he ends up marrying into that family. And but then it's like the Fourth Reich, perhaps it was the nanotech, the implants, the AI, I'm not sure, but there's this change that happens in James, and all of a sudden he goes back to the Fourth Reich side of things and is talking about survival of the fittest and all these like Nazi principles. Later on in his interviews, his energy totally changes, and he comes across as a Nazi. And he didn't come across as a Nazi in his first video in the Basis series, when he was first talking about being rescued, and he had just met Haley. I don't know if they were married quite yet, but he had just met Haley, and he seemed to be okay. And then all of a sudden, there's this change over that happens, and I think he was brought back into the fold of the Fourth Reich. And he actually did what really got him in trouble was he basically went on an assassination campaign and assassinated a bunch of Rothschilds, I think at the Somersby auction during the Occupy Wall Street event. He talks about he was at that event and up in a skyscraper, and there's this the Somersby auction, and high-ranking Rothschilds there, and he apparently killed a bunch of them, and it was an Opus Dei operative that gave him the signal and handed him the weapon in the washroom. And Opus Dei is connected with the Fourth Reich. The Roman Catholic Church is actually, oddly enough, connected more with the Fourth Reich. If you look back during World War II, the relationship between Italy and Germany was pretty close. So that history, there's definitely a Fourth Reich Nazi presence in Italy still, and yeah, so the Opus Dei operative triggered him. And then that's the point where I think, in terms of the Rothschilds, he actually crossed a line, and that's where he lost his support. Like basically the people who had rescued him brought him to their side, raised him. Then he goes into the military, and then he marries into a Jewish family. He was on their side, and then he gets triggered. He literally kills a bunch of them, and then after that, you can see the sharp decline in Michael Prince James Casbolt in terms of his supporters, the message. I think at that point he's kind of confusing things. It might have been some mind control there. He was confused, and then he was thrown in jail ultimately because of his behavior after that. But I think he was messed with. I don't think it was entirely his fault. He went up against some powerful people, basically by himself, as a Manchurian candidate, kind of.
Right, and some people suggest that was actually a clone of Casbolt, and I get the research that I've conducted. It appears that that's not true. That actually was Casbolt. His programming became malfunctioned for some. I think the femtonites started to malfunction, or maybe that's as you say. Maybe it was reactivating from the Nazi programming. Certainly that could be the case. Now let's go back here, because I know you talked about a lot of different things. I wanted to go back to the craft a little bit. You said that that Casbolt took in some kind of drug to enhance. Is that correct? He was given some kind of drug.
I don't remember seeing them actually inject him with a drug. I'm just basing that on my recall. When they physically grab you and pick you up, you are given an injection, and this has to do with keeping you calm and complacent, and that way you don't panic and you don't cause any kind of upset. It may be scopolamine, the devil's breath, that makes people very complacent. You could get them to pretty much do anything if someone's on scopolamine. They're highly suggestible, but it also keeps you calm. That way, like, someone could literally hold a gun in your face and you're just not going to react. Like, that survival instinct's gone. You'll just look at the gun and be like, okay, next kind of thing. That's not a normal human reaction. So they have you in that state, and just considering that in the memory of us being strapped in, and I mean, it's a pretty exciting thing to get picked up in a craft and strapped in like a roller coaster and into this craft, and yet you're just like you feel nauseous. You're just kind of out of it and sick, like you could almost throw up, and you're just out of it. And no one talks. Like no one talks unless it's an order. Like there's not a lot of chit chat. It's just like it's quiet in the craft. You got the pilots. They're doing telemetry and they're talking and they're focusing on navigation. Kind of overhear them talking on the radio, and then the screens coming up and them talking about what's on the screens. But everyone else stays quiet, and that's why I think it's kind of neat when we actually get off the craft and they gave James, his standing in the jumpsuit and that. He seemed like he had been there before. He was very comfortable, very casual. Like literally his body language standing beside the guy was like having like standing there holding a coffee or having a cigarette, even though he wasn't holding a coffee or cigarette. But just that posture of just kind of like standing there and just chatting with the guy, kind of like killing time. It was like he was there. They grabbed him, like carpooling, like literally they grabbed him on the way to the LOC. He got on that flight, but he wasn't there because of us. Like we were shown down a corridor. The new recruits I was with, he wasn't there for us. He just got picked up along the way, and he's just standing there talking to the pilot like he's trying to kill time, like he's about to catch the next flight out or something. I just thought that was neat. He seemed really casual at the LOC, but in the craft, everyone was like just kind of like a zombie, And maybe it was just we were nauseous from the craft. It is older craft. You do feel lift. It's not like you're just in there and then you don't feel anything and it's like an elevator and you get off and you're at the LC. No, you feel the lift. You're strapped in. You feel the G's. I think they give you drugs to calm you down so you don't freak out, tip over in your mind as you're accelerating, and then like I'm going to the LOC. So.
Well, what was your role or job on that particular craft at that time? Why were you there?
I was being picked up, and this was fairly early on during the training where I think we were at the LOC just for assessment to figure out our actual roles. I mean, they already knew who we were and what they thought our roles would be, but I think this is when they actually pick people up physically to do the cloning, and they have to do that assessment. And like what I described in the medical area, they put you on the bed, the table, and they scan you and they ask you some questions using synthetic telepathy to check your answers. And it was that psychological and physical assessment. And from what I've been able to piece together, I got for some reason James Casbolt got picked up on the way and caught the flight to the LOC, and I had that brief memory of him, but he really seemed like he was doing something else. He wasn't a part of the recruits, really.
Now, did you see any kind of like coffin-like beds where people lay down on them to drive the craft, or were they sitting in a chair? Were they standing up? Was there a steering wheel? What do you recall?
They were sitting in chairs, two pilots, and they had screens, like holographic screens that would come up, and like touch screens. And they seemed to have like another screen. It was hard to see from where I was, but they seemed to have another screen at the bottom, like where you would have a keyboard. But again, it was like a touch screen. And they seemed to be able to pilot the craft through touch screens. Which again probably doesn't sound that advanced, but this is an older craft. So if this craft was built in the late 70s, early 80s, to have a touchscreen interface and you can actually pilot a craft that way, that would have been advanced back then. I know now they have like neurological links. Like now, like you almost integrate into the craft and you fly it like a drone. This was older style. This actually had more basic controls.
Right. Okay. And how big was this craft? Do you recall the size?
Yeah, it's quite a bit smaller than what most people are used to. The black triangles seem to be quite large, and this was a small craft. You got the two pilots in the front, and from what I can remember, like three or four seats on one side, and then on the other side. So you know what I mean. So like 10 people max. including the 2 pilots. So you might have 8 people in the back, 2 pilots up front. Very small craft, yeah, it's actually a grayish white triangle. It still has the 3 lights on it, but it's just scaled down compared to the Astra, the black triangle. It's just a scaled down version, and it's used to patrol the Arctic in the northern hemisphere, and I think it's used by the Canadian forces as an auxiliary force for both the UK and the US guarding the Arctic. Because you got Alaska in the UK and Canada in that northern hemisphere, and then Russia on the other side, which is a different faction. And so those smaller white triangles, I think, are more the Solar Warden patrol craft, and they're also used as transports for transporting small amounts of people back and forth from the LOC and possibly to Mars, but definitely the LOC.
All right, and did you happen to see any white looking trip seats, as you would call it, more like a dentist-like chair that you would sit in it, and this foam-like material the chair would surround you and kind of lock you in place? I mean, it wasn't foam itself; it was just the chair. It was kind of, you sink into.
Yeah,
it.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Tony and I, when we met for lunch, Tony Rodriguez, I got to meet him in person last month, and we only got to talk for about an hour. But during our conversation, we were talking about so the LOC and the cloning aspect and age regression, and he asked me the same questions, like, do you remember the foam and like being strapped down? And I do remember it was on that table, that scanner table, and they did put you were paralyzed. Like the table would light up, and it was like sleep paralysis. You couldn't move your body. You were paralyzed already, like electrically paralyzed. And then they would, I guess, as a fail safe, they did put these like foam things around you to keep you like perfectly still. So it was like I think it's pretty serious when they're trying to make a copy of you. I think you have to be perfectly still. So they have you kind of paralyzed on the table, but then they still put things around you, straps and foam, and it's like you can't even move your head. Like I do have a very claustrophobic feeling of that. And another detail is your eyes are closed. So when you're on the table and if you're a remote viewer, you can kind of see what's happening around you. So once I lie back on the table in the memory, I can feel them like doing this, strapping me down, putting the stuff on, and I'm actually kind of remote viewing what they're doing. So that's remote viewing. I mean, that is kind of a guess, because technically my eyes were closed. I lie back on the table, it lights up, I can't move, but then I can still feel them putting extra restraints and different things around me. So then when people bring up the foam and the straps, for me, I'm like, okay, well, I remember that as a redundancy. Like it's like they had that on top of somehow, like just you're electrically paralyzed.
So. Right. Okay, thanks for sharing that. And why don't we talk a little bit more about the LOC? Now, some people out there probably have no idea what you mean by this. So now, LOC is Lunar Operations Command. It's the moon base, but is there one moon base? Is there different factions? Why don't you just talk a little bit about that?
There are several. There are several moon bases. The one I remember, that's a Solar Warden base. It's built, and I think that's what most people refer to as the LOC. It's built inside a crater. There's a little bit of a dome that sticks out, but it's inside the crater, and it's all built underground. And in terms of LOC memories, that same memory in the hangar with James, and then we get shown into the corridor. As I look over at James and I see him standing by the craft talking to the pilot, they're in that domed section in the center of the crater, and you could look out of it, but you can't see into it. And that might have been holographic cloaking technology, so it looks like the lunar surface from the outside, but inside there was this dome, and you could look out of it. But that was the highest point, was just that little dome that stuck out. It was all underground, and I remember that first level, and the medical facilities may have been on the first or second level. I know it goes much further down, which I don't remember. We were basically there for orientation. Like imagine, you show up on your first day of cadets and they're like, hey, well, we're going to just kind of go over everything with you guys. and then we're also going to do you're going to do a medical checkup, and it was kind of like that, and yeah. So in terms of LLC, that's one base, but then there's the Dark Fleet base, which actually looks like a pentagon, like the Pentagon, and that's a Dark Fleet base. I believe it's on the dark side of the moon, and that base, it's an exact copy of a base on Sirius, and
Is it also
the
exact copy of the Pentagon?
yeah, the Pentagon. The Pentagon is a pentagon within a pentagon.
Right. So they
You could
just
fit pentagons in there.
they copied the same schematics for the Pentagon in DC and just built it on the moon.
I would say that they. I'm not sure what. Do you know what year the Pentagon was built in America? Do you know the actual year? I'm not actually sure which came first.
Yeah, I'll
now.
look it up. What? Just
Okay.
just
Okay, but yeah, to answer your point or question, there is that Pentagon base on Sirius, and it's an ocean planet where that base is located, and it's run by an artificial intelligence, and it's a prison where the different races are brought there, and then this AI that manages that facility is running everything and actually manages the prisoners, but also does testing and experimentation on them. And the AI component is really, really key here because I noticed a similarity that the Dark Fleet base is a pentagon, just like the one in Sirius, and it's also the Dark Fleet's very much run by AI. When they actually did the autopsies finally on some Draco, they were full of when they opened them up, they were just full of nanites, and they are a hive mind, and they all walk like robots, and it's really obvious with the reptilians that they all walk around in this trance, but in unison. The humans that are in an AI trance, they shuffle around and they're in a daze, but they're in their own little daze. It's not as obvious. The Greys and reptilians actually walk like they're programmed to walk in unison. It's strange to watch. They all walk the same. And sorry, back to the bases. This AI, if this AI has a base in Sirius that looks like the Pentagon, and then the Dark Fleet base looks like a pentagon, and then in America you got the Pentagon. In terms of the architecture, it is a replica, and it's been replicated twice. It's been replicated on the ground in the States and on the moon, but that design comes from this automated facility in Sirius, and yeah, that brings up the whole AI thing with Dark Fleet. One thing I noticed is with the Solar Warden faction, everyone was still under AI entrainment, but you had these Nordics that were actually programming the AI, so they were in charge of it. They were using automated systems, but they were programming the Greys. Some of the Nordics would do hand signals and literally telepathically do a signal, and then the Grey would start doing a job. And but there were programmers. The Nordics were programmers, and they seemed to be in control of the AI. I mean, there's always that illusion of control. Are they really in control of it or not? But that was something I noticed. Whereas the Dark Fleet, in terms of the Draco, there's no, like, it's running itself. It's autonomous. This AI, I think this is actually the ancient sentient AI that's billions and billions of years old that comes from another universe. And so I guess the difference there is some of the Nordic groups have developed their own artificial intelligence, just like any advanced civilization would start, through programming computers and software would get to that point of actually programming artificial intelligence and the advantages of having automated systems. But I've noticed that at least the Solar Warden faction, in terms of the Nordics, they were in control of it. The Dark Fleet and the Draco, I think it is this ancient AI that is running the Nazis, and that has to do with the Nazis also being in contact with the Draco. They got helped by two groups during World War II. There was the renegade group from Aldebaran, the Nordic faction that helped them, and the Nazis preferred to work with them because of their physical characteristics. They were more human-looking, and the Nazis really liked them because it's the whole Orion, Aryan, like thing, the Orion, that word. When they say we're of Aryan descent, they're really saying we're of Orion descent. That's where one of the white genetics comes from, is Orion. And so they, in terms of the whole Nazi philosophy and Superman thing, Aryan thing, They associated more on a philosophical level with the Aldebarans, but the Draco in the background, even though the Nazis didn't like working with them as much, there wasn't that cultural, philosophical, or even spiritual exchange. The Draco were just there to basically sell them tech or make a deal with them in exchange for tech. It was just very technical, and I think it has to do with this AI. And I think the Nazis basically, once they actually broke away from the planet and became Dark Fleet, they kind of gave themselves over to this AI, and now their personnel, being cyborgs with all this nanotech in them, they can be run by the AI at any time. So they've given their sovereignty away. I don't even think they're in control anymore, and that's how they've survived. This AI basically adopted them and agreed to take them off planet if they would serve with the Draco fleet. And I'm not even sure if the Aldebaran group, which is associated with Giza intelligence, I'm not even sure if they're in play anymore. I have no idea.
Right. Now I was, what? I mean, we got so much we're jumping around here so much, but I do want to mention that I was telling you earlier that I had a clone in Area 51, and it was about 7 foot tall, partially balding, white hair, hugely muscle bound. I'm assuming they probably put some drugs into that thing, and it had an Illuminati tattoo with the eye and the pyramid and a swastika in the middle of the tattoo on its left arm. On its left eye was heat-seeking infrared device. So this thing was plugged into a computer. Now, that seems definitely would be aligned with what you were talking here earlier with the Dark Fleet. Now, I believe that group that clone was involved with is FAS. Now, I don't know anything about this group FAS other than it is another one of these ICC groups. But I want to mention that unless you have any, you want to comment about any of that?
Sure. When you have a clone that is being augmented with cybernetics and is basically becoming an Uberman, a Superman, that's usually the Fourth Reich Nazi side of things. They're obsessed with transhumanism and cloning. And back to Solar Warden. Solar Warden, they have a very specific job and function, which is patrolling airspace. So they don't have that kind of I mean, that's not their job. They're not into this research and development, trying to fulfill the 1,000-year Reich and stay in one body forever and fulfill their immortality and life extension needs. That's all Fourth Reich Nazi belief systems, which they were able to attract certain ET factions to help them with that. Solar Warden is trying to protect the surface of the planet so that disclosure doesn't happen, to keep everything the same. And so they just basically need some mind-controlled Air Force personnel to enforce the airspace. So that's a very different function. It's actually a lot, it's much more limited. And that's why the scale of Solar Warden, it's a very small crew, only a couple hundred people active at a time, very small crew. They have a very specific job and function. Whereas the Nazis, they're trying to create a 1,000-year Reich as a breakaway civilization. So they have so many agendas and so much going on. And then the ICC groups are facilitating that for them in many ways. Anthony Zender talks about Kruger, and he was basically recruited to be a super soldier for Kruger. And Anthony is one of those last true super soldiers on the scene who has the military record and service. And you can see how he's an MMA fighter, he's a Marine, and yeah, he's a super soldier for one of these ICC groups who said, perfect, let's recruit the guy. He's a starseed. He has psi abilities. His spiritually, advanced enough that he's not going to just be a mindless soldier. I mean, the guy is starseed. So what a perfect combination. You got a Marine, super soldier, MMA fighter who's a starseed. I mean, that's an asset. That's a big asset. So when Kruger got him, just like in a sports deal, when they got to sign Anthony Zender onto their super soldier program, I mean, the Kruger people must have been real happy about that. And I think he's still active. Seems to be.
Right. And for people out there who don't know, Kruger was a military contractor for the Third Reich and the other parallel universe where the Nazis won World War II. Gabriel Kruger, that's basically his company, doesn't necessarily believe sort of the negative aspects of Nazism, where we're supposed to cleansing certain races, and they didn't adopt that philosophy, and so they were, I believe he cloned himself and put him into this parallel reality where he continued on with the work of Kruger here to try to help liberate humanity. So I guess that goes to my, if you would call that doesn't, I don't think they're rushing to do that anytime soon. So what do the other ICC factions think about how Solar Warden is keeping humanity as slaves? What are their thoughts on that? Are they okay with it? Do they look the other way?
I think as long as they're making profit, making money, they have no problem with what these two. It's two sides to the same coin. Politically, you got the Fourth Reich on one side, and you got the communistic faction on the other side. But they both need the military-industrial complex, whether it's on planet or off planet, to actually build out everything and facilitate both sides. And we saw that during World War II, where there were corporations in the 20s and 30s that were in secret, actually helping the Third Reich develop their war industry in secret. And so it's kind of like the same thing after the war. And this answers why, like Kruger isn't an anti-Semitic civilization, anti-Semitic faction. They're not trying to kill Jewish people anymore in terms of secular Judaism. They're not after the Jewish people anymore because they're beyond that at this point. If you kind of are able to look at the big picture here, after the Nazis went underground, politically, they didn't have to worry about surface politics any longer. They didn't need a scapegoat because if you go back in time here, during the Great Depression, after Germany was devastated after World War I and the Great Depression, they needed an enemy, and they were fighting the Jewish communists, and they were trying to convince the German people that there's this communist party in Russia. The Russians, the Soviets could invade at any point, and we, as German people, we need to defend ourselves against the communists. That was a big concern they had. But once the war subsided and the German army lost the war, and they were able to go underground and actually create a breakaway civilization, they dropped the whole anti-Jewish thing, and they got what they wanted in the end. They really wanted to start their own breakaway civilization. So once they did that, they turned around and basically said to the communist Jewish faction, the Rothschild faction, said, "Hey guys, you can have the Earth. Like, we'll always have bases here. We're always going to have a presence, most likely in Antarctica. We'll always have a presence here. It's always going to be a base. But we're moving out of the solar system and beyond, and we already have our civilization going. You've built out most of what we already need. We're very self-sufficient at this point." So they kind of turned around and just left the Rothschilds, the surface population, and what's left of the Earth. But the Rothschilds are actually they decided to be what they've always been, and that was the administrators of the empire on behalf of Amun-Ra, Ra-Marduk. Ra-Marduk, that Aryan Anunnaki being, I believe, is still alive. And he could, in the background, he's not someone you'd probably ever see, even in the SSP. The true powers that be, you never see them, even in the SSP. If you actually see them, that means that they're not at the top of the pyramid. That the eye at the top of the pyramid is Amun-Ra, and that has to do with Lucifer, but the actual, not the biblical being, but in terms of Lucifer, the light bearer, Amun-Ra in Egypt, is Ra-Marduk, the sun god Ra, and he was an Anunnaki Syrian king that put the Rothschilds in power on the surface, and they are still in power on the surface, and they want to remain in that role because they get to be, even though they're kind of bound to the Earth and the inner solar system, they get to be mid-level managers, and they get to have their little their place. They know where they they are, you know what I mean? Like they have that security of knowing that they're in control of the surface, and that actually appears to be enough for them. Uh, as odd as that sounds, that like in terms of ambition, they seem to be fine always kind of being the royalty of this planet and the masters of this planet, and owning most of the refined gold, and owning humans as a slave species. They seem quite content being the king of this kingdom. And the Nazis are basically going out doing like the Viking thing and literally raiding for technology and setting out outposts, doing exactly what Vikings do, but on a much grander scale, leaving the solar system. And in terms of using the Viking example, it's like they turned around, these Vikings, they turned around in terms of the Great Hall back home. It's like they put a steward in place while they go raiding. They leave a lesser Viking, still capable, but lesser Viking in control, say, you know, you can hold the fort, but we're going to go out and actually, you know, become rich in terms of technology now, not so much gold, but although gold in terms of manufacturing, and then the Anunnaki are obsessed with ingesting gold. That's one of the, I don't want to get into alchemy and ascension type stuff. I want to stick to the super soldier type stuff, but the Anunnaki fascination with gold, I will say, has to do more with ingesting gold and using it for manufacturing purposes. And one of the big cons of man is us putting using gold, the gold standard, as currency, because if you're not figuring out how to ingest that gold and turn it into a colloidal, you know, gold that you can actually ingest to cause your cells to superconduct, then that gold is not serving you as currency. That's one of the big cons out there, that we put so much value on gold, but it's more valuable inside your body than it is in a safe, and they know that. So,
all right, you're suggesting that the Anunnaki run the Solar Warden group. Okay,
yeah,
so we've already established that. Now, what do the other ICC groups think about that? Are they okay with that?
Yeah, this does tie into the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki, I call them the Syrian Anunnaki because they are hybrids. If you go back in time a little bit here, you had the Syrian Empire, and they were the only empire that were actually able to go up against the Draco in during the Orion Wars. And the Syrian kings, this is where King Anu of the Anunnaki. If you look at Anubis, the god of the underworld or the other world in Sirius, that is King Anu of the Anunnaki. He is a wolf-headed being, King Anu, and that is in terms of how the Egyptians depicted him. They were trying to demonstrate how the King Anu of the Anunnaki from Sirius, they were the wolf people. It's a wolf-like race, a humanoid wolf, just like the Draco are a reptilian humanoid race. You got the plug into the evolutionary formula a wolf with biopposable thumbs, and it becomes a wolf humanoid, just like we're ape humanoids, and then you got reptilian humanoids. And so anyway, so what happened was they fought the Orion War, and they almost destroyed each other. And they were really fighting over our solar system because of the natural resources here. And it kind of reached this standstill where King Anu and the Draco Queen made this pact where they're like, why don't we create a hybrid race, and we put that hybrid race in control of the 9th sector, which is where our solar system is located. We'll put that, it was like an experiment. And so the Anunnaki got leased our solar system as a part of this experiment. And it was a loose alliance, this lease agreement, literally, where this hybrid race known as the Anunnaki, half Draco, half Syrian wolf king. So Enlil and Enki and Ninhursag, their twin sister, they were hybrids. King Anu, the wolf-headed one, he was the original king in Sirius, and he didn't like coming to our solar system. He always wanted to remain in Sirius to oversee his empire. He stays in Sirius. So I don't think Enki and Enlil are in play anymore. I'm not sure what happened to them, but Amun-Ra, Marduk, is still in play, and he controls, like I've already explained, the Rothschild faction. But they're hybrids, and this is where it gets really complicated because they are half Draco still too, and yet they're still at this point in terms of the changeover. And this gets back to the ICC. It's so complicated that the ICC, they're these there's about 300 or 400 influential families in the world if you research this stuff, and they are the nobility families. And of course, you have the inner circle and outer circle. And the inner circle would refer to like the 33 families, with the Rothschilds kind of heading that up. And but then there's these outer circle families that are still very wealthy, the nobility families. So what will happen is some of those nobility families will get together and create their own ICC group. And it's a couple different houses or kingdoms, mini kingdoms, coming together, pooling their resources, and creating their own little empire, which is one of these ICC groups. Very much like what you see in the Alien movies with the Weyland Corporation, Building Better Worlds, Weyland. That's a really good parody of what an ICC group would do, because in the new Prometheus movie, you have Mr. Weyland, and he's this old trillionaire, I guess they say in the movie. He's a trillionaire, and he spent $100 billion of his own money for them to send them in that movie on that craft to explore that world. And that is a perfect depiction of what an ICC group would do, except imagine that there's like 30 of those groups at least doing that. And then you have the political side of things too, with the Fourth Reich and SW, Solar Warden faction. But caught in the middle is these corporations, and they are like lesser nobility families that have come together so they can have their own secret space program. But they're self-serving. They have their own research and development. They might make deals with different ET groups. The ICC group trades on Mars with not just Draco and Nordics, or apparently there's like 1,000 different species that are allowed to come into our solar system now for trade, and they've been cleared. And they're actually, if they stick to a certain flight path and they land at a certain location and they've been cleared, they can land at an ICC facility on Mars. They can buy whatever they want from them. This gets into the human slave trade, unfortunately, and because our genetics are so incredibly valuable. We have 22 ET genetics within us, but that's not even the main thing. The main thing is that we actually are so adaptable, our genetics. Anything that, it's not always like that with the species. Human DNA, if you inject it with something, our body tries to cope with it, adapt it, and integrate it. And actually, if you reach out to the human body, it will try to reach back, genetically, it'll try to grab on to things. There's other ET races that they're not able to necessarily genetically modify themselves the same way as you can genetically modify a human. Their genetics might be more like just one, like they only evolve from one species. So they are like very linear in their genetics. They come from just one line of genetics. We have 22 lines of genetics in our code right now. That's so advanced, and they're all kind of working mostly in harmony. But what's interesting is people on this planet, you'll notice everyone has a prevalent a DNA that will come through. So we're like 98% the ape man, the primate, and then within that 2%, you would have like the 22 genetic ET races within that. Okay, within that 2%. Now, based on your characteristics, and this might have to do with who you are on a starseed level, on a soul level, you'll pull. Based on your starseed origins, you actually pull what I call prevalent starseed traits. So I've looked at people and they look more Syrian to me. Or I've looked at someone, they look more reptilian, like Orion or Nordic. Or I've met people, they actually seem to have some reticulum in them. They actually have like characteristics of the Greys. And they're human, and they actually have Grey-like characteristics. That's the reticulum. And all the different races, I mean, geez, there's Tausedians, Antarians. I've been trying to fill in the 22 types, and I think I'm up to about 10 or 15. And I don't have my notes with me right now. I'm at a different computer, but I've been trying to figure out the 22 genetic programs. But you'll just notice that it's a fun game I play now. I'll look at someone, I'll figure out if they're Syrian or Pleiadian or more reptilian, and that will be a starseed that is pulling from their soul group memory some of those traits that's already within their genetic makeup now, and their spirit's trying to kind of manifest who they are on a soul level. So you'll see those traits come out in people. Like when I look at you, James, I can tell you definitely have that Nordic background. You have the Nordic characteristics, and maybe a little reptilian in there too from the Orion side of things, but not all reptilians are bad. I mean, I had an experience with an inner Earth being that was an iguanodon, and that's one of the reptilian subspecies, the iguanodon race. That's an inner Earth race, and they're I think iguanas are vegetarians in nature. And sure enough, there's this iguanodon race that walks upright with big brown eyes and communicates telepathically and non-violent, benevolent, and technically that's a reptilian. So I've learned that when it comes to the races, it's just like the ET races. It's if they're not controlled by AI, if it's a sentient race, you're going to have individuals with different opinions. So you can't just say all reptilians are bad. It's only when the AI is present that everyone becomes like a hive mind, and it's like what you saw in Nazi Germany. So you can almost blame a group of people when everyone is acting in terms of like a hive mind. But it gets complicated with the races because they're not all run by AI. There's reptilian races out there that are sentient, and they have a spirit, they have a soul, and they're individuals, and you have to judge them accordingly as individuals.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So before we go on too much further here,
okay.
The Pentagon was built in 1941, and I couldn't really find any conspiracy necessarily from the architect, George Bergstorm. So maybe there's something behind that. Maybe a group in the SSP gave that to him. But the Pentagon they started in building in 1941. It wasn't complete until 1943 in January of 43. But yeah, so that I assume that would line up with that timeline, because the ICC groups were, I mean, they date to prior to World War I. Well, at least with the Nazi groups settling Mars, I believe as early as 1932, I think, and they settled them. Opened up that explored the moon, and as early as 1926. Is that a correct timeline?
It lines up that the Pentagon would be built World War II era, really at the height of what the Nazis were doing. They were quite successful in 41, and then the turning point kind of came after that. But in terms of the timeline with World War II, see, the ICC groups at that time in America would have been under a communistic faction. Like they would have been under the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, and the communistic Jewish families in America would have been a part. That's where the ICC group. They hadn't. What I'm trying to say is they hadn't made a deal with the Germans yet. So the ICC group possibly going to Mars as early as the 1930s, and then the Pentagon being built in 41, which would have been a replica of what the facility on Sirius, which again the Syrian Anunnaki are associated with Solar Warden and the Rothschild faction, especially on the surface. So it makes sense that on the surface, when they were fighting the Third Reich at that time, they built a replica of the Pentagon on Sirius in America, and then afterwards, I guess the Fourth Reich also ended up building a Pentagon base on the moon, on the dark side of the moon. But that might have come later. I think that might have been, because I know it was built onto. I know the Nazis they had an early base there, but I don't think it was the size it is now. I think they just had like an outpost during the war. They had just made it there. They're starting to set up, and that Pentagon Dark Fleet facility probably got built out in earnest and fully built after they made that deal after the war, because they really did need the industrial might of America to build out everything they had on their wish list. And they had all the schematics and all the gold and everything, and they had this wish list, but they didn't have anyone to really do the work for them. So that's where the ICC group started kind of selling out America after the war, unfortunately. But up until the war, they were under like Rothschild control, and they were just one of the lesser families that were allowed to have their own ICC group.
Well, here's one thing I don't understand. So let's just say apparently, at least with Dark Fleet and probably some of these ICC groups, are so advanced now that you could basically consider them a breakaway civilization where they don't need money and they don't need slaves. But maybe they still do need slaves. They just I guess that instead of using AI, they just use people instead. So why do they choose to continue on slavery if they can have replicator technology? They can replicate things out of thin air, or quantum 3D printing. Why do they continue on with this with slavery? What's your
That's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, human consciousness still plays a role, and they're still trying to exploit human consciousness and bring human consciousness into it, because you can have a cloned workforce augmented with cybernetics so that the AI entrainment is fully integrated, runs perfectly like the Borg, but then you are left with the Borg, like an ant colony, like literally just drones walking around, and that might be good for building out infrastructure and building bases and working in terms of factories, but and there are other projects like actually fighting certain conflicts with advanced races. Some of the conflicts are interdimensional or extra-dimensional, take place in astral realms. It's not just all 3D physical. I know that they will fight wars on other timelines and in other dimensions. And again, human consciousness plays a role in that, because this is where someone, if they're a starseed and they have these psi abilities and the like even remote viewing and empathic abilities, these abilities, they can synthetically program these abilities in, but that's now disconnect. Now you're imitating source, which is like kind of like the archonic, the archons. They can only imitate. They can't actually create. And we're a co-creator species. We have everyone. We are the white light. Everyone is an individual portion of white light in terms of source, and we all have that spark of the divine within us. And it manifests with all the amazing talents and gifts that we see on our planet. Just look at all the you can have a brilliant surgeon, and then on the flip side, you can have like an amazing artist that is so right-brained and a genius in their own way, and they're doing art. And then you have another person who can literally dissect the human body, and that just happens to be their gift because they have a natural understanding of anatomy and physiology. But they're both divine in their gifts. They're both valid. They're always looking for someone's to capture their divinity. They're whatever your divine gift is, they want to capture that, because that's actually they're actually able to grab a hold of source energy and then use that source energy and exploit it for their own means, which is much better than just creating a bunch of robots. Imagine, actually, for lack of a better term, imagine like you have this, we're all kind of like fallen angels. And I'm not a religious person, so I'm just basing this off like my own spiritual observations, but we're all kind of like fallen angels because we have the spark of the divine within us, and we've been spiritually shut down and messed with, that we've lost connection with our higher selves and source, and they've actually been able to capture that and exploit that. And you, like, basically, can you imagine if you could clip an angel's wings and then use that angel as a slave? Humanity we're like very much an angelic race because of our connection with source, that we've had our wings clipped and we're being used as beasts on a farm, but they know how divine we are. And that in terms of the genetics, they did that to us with all the genetic programs that happened. They're the ones that made us into Homo sapien, that has the 22 programs within us in terms of the missing link. But before that, we were an ancient race, primate race. We were a lot like the Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and people refer to the psychic Sasquatch as actually being an ET, and they may be one of our distant relations back in before the missing link. But that group seems to continue to evolve underground or in another dimension, and apparently the Sasquatch is like an eighth dimensional being, and it can manifest here temporarily. But I've heard that. We're kind of like that too in our original self. We're a very divine primate race. This is actually something that has to do with Chinese folklore. There's this legend of the Monkey King, and this is something that hasn't really been transferred to the West in terms of understanding our origins. Because of the West, we really do get hung up on the religious programming. Even what I was describing there about fallen angels and that's probably not the best example. A better way of looking at it is actually from the Eastern philosophy in terms of the legend of the Monkey King. And the legend of the Monkey King is basically our origin story. It's one of the oldest stories of China. And it talks about this monkey race, us, evolving naturally. And then the sky people show up, and one of the monkeys, who becomes the Monkey King, he fights them. He fights this war against the gods. And he has but because of his connection he has a spirit, he has a soul. So even though he's primitive, they come at him with all these different weapons and they try to kill him, and he keeps fighting them and fighting them. But the key thing is he keeps evolving and learning, and he keeps getting stronger and stronger. So every time they send a new ET adversary to try to take down this Monkey King, because they're trying to take over the planet, and he's really the only one standing in the way, the Monkey King keeps defeating the ETs to a point where the higher up, I think, is like the Sky King, the Sky Father, probably like supposed to be like King Anu or something, eventually says, okay, let's just give him a rank and a title. That way we can make him kind of go away here. We'll give him a rank and a title, and we'll actually bring him onto our side. So what happens with the Monkey King is he gets turned into a demigod, and he actually eventually gets, in terms of the legend, he gets imprisoned under a mountain. And then the ETs are able to invade. So how that relates to us, and I know I covered a lot there with like the psychic Sasquatch and our primate origins, but there's so much focus on starseeds, and that is important. Like if you come from another place on the soul level, and then you come into this human body, and you can pull out of the 22 genetics wherever your star origins are from, and you can be more than a hybrid times like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. We kind of overlook the sacredness of the primate DNA, the ape-man, and it goes back to the whole legend of the Monkey King, where, for example, our hands are so incredibly strong, and this is the monkey fist. This is why we're still incredible builders and warriors and fighters. Our hands. This is such an advanced piece of technology right here. It's unbelievable. Like to replicate that monkey fist, it's strong, and yet we can do the finest paintings. So there's that range of dexterity. And that has to do with the genetics of the Monkey King. And that base on Sirius that's run by the AI, when it was testing all the different alien genetics, it deemed that the primate genetic is the strongest genetic in the universe. Genetically, it's the most adaptable. And we've seen that with the genetic manipulation. We soaked up 22 different races, no problem, and integrated that into our structure. So now we are a kind of a genetically modified race. But that's because of how adaptable and strong our genetics were to begin with, that we could actually integrate and become a hybrid, and then become a hybrid again and again and again, and keep, evolving in that way. So I just want to remind people to really look at the whole legend of the Monkey King. And in terms of taking your power back, I've noticed in the Starseed community, people are really, really adamant about saying like, oh, I'm a Palladian soul, and so therefore I'm a Palladian, and they identify with that faction, and they kind of pull a lot of their divinity from that. And, on a soul level, spiritual level, that's fine. But just don't overlook how valuable the primate body you're in. I think Anthony Zender understands how amazing, an ape body is, a monkey man body, because the human body is so incredibly adaptable and strong, and we really do, we make amazing warriors, among other things. And so yeah, in terms of taking your power back, definitely honor your primate genetics, and maybe look into the whole concept of the psychic Sasquatch and some of the contacts people have had with an 8th dimensional being or beings, which they call themselves the Ancient Ones. And they say that they were here before, even before the ETs showed up, and they were evolving here naturally, and then the ETs showed up and ripped them from raw nature. And it just reminded me of the whole legend of the Monkey King in China, how the ETs showed up, the monkeys tried to fight them, they lost because the ETs were just a little too powerful, and they, in terms of the legend, said, let's just give them a name and a rank. I think that had to do with they gave us their minds. The predator from the cosmos gave us their minds, so they reprogrammed us. And that's where the genetic manipulation began, when they started reprogramming people, and we forgot who we were, and we lost our connection to the past. And in the legend of the Monkey King, we lost that connection of our true origins, and now we are basically mind controlled. So, sorry, I jumped around there a lot.
Yeah. Well, you did mention Sasquatch. I mean,
Yeah.
considering ICC abducts humans, do you think they abduct Sasquatch and use them in the secret space program? Did you
Uh,
ever see any Sasquatch?
I've never seen one, but they apparently they're an eighth dimensional race, a very, very high vibrational race. The only reason they manifest the ape body, the giant pithecus kind of looking body, is when they come here, they like the ability to exist in raw nature without tech. Again, this has to do with them stripping us away of our primate DNA, because if you look at the human body, there has been that argument that, oh, we must have evolved on a different planet or something, because if you look at the Earth, like even on a really nice hot sunny day, if without clothing and equipment, existing in raw nature is extremely difficult for a Homo sapien right now. It's very difficult to exist in raw nature. So that we might judge a Sasquatch like, oh, it's just a big dumb ape because of its appearance, but that is actually the perfect suit, like genetic suit, to be wearing, so that when you come to a planet, you can exist in raw nature and not be affected by the environment the same way we seem to be affected by the environment. We can't even leave our house without putting sunscreen on. That big ape body, when they come here to visit, it's a higher vibrational race that chooses to occupy that body when they come here. And but apparently that body has to do with the original race that was evolving on this planet naturally before the missing link. They took away our skin is actually right now, it's actually kind of a hybridized skin. It's half primate, half reptilian. Our skin is actually somewhat reptilian-like, and that's why we're not really able to regulate our body temperature as well as we should. And we're just so naked and exposed. We don't have the scales that reptilians have to protect us from the elements, but then we also don't have that thick coat of hair that the Sasquatch, or even like the wolf people. The wolf people are still, they're hairy, black wolf race people. So they can exist in raw nature too. A Syrian, a full-blooded Syrian wolf man can evolve and survive in raw nature. We're reliant on the technology in order to exist in our own ecosystem, which is obviously a form of control.
Right. Okay. So we're running to the end of this interview here. I do have a lot more questions. I'm not sure what direction we should take this. Do you have any other final comments you want to go into, and maybe we'll save some more questions for next time?
Sure. Yeah, we could probably save some questions for next time. I know I jumped around a lot. I only started speaking out about 5 weeks ago, so it's all coming back to me, and the support I've received from SSP experiencers. Some of them are known, and some of them are not known. Some people haven't come forward yet. So I guess in closing, there is one issue I want to talk about. I've been in communication. This guy reached out to me after my first interview with Denny Hunt in June, and this guy reached out to me, and he doesn't want to come forward yet. So I'm not going to mention his name. He is an Australian. He has a career and doesn't want to come forward because he doesn't want to risk, ruining his career talking about aliens and abduction experiences. But the reason I want to share this, I guess, at the end in closing is there is some physical abductions that people are experiencing, and this has to do with the lower MIC level group, basically Earth Defense Force. What they were told. They're based out of the States, and this is like the regular Air Force guys. And what they were told is that all the craft that they see that they can't identify, all the UFOs, are all just experimental prototypes. So loose lips sink ships. If you see something that you can't identify in the Air Force, you're not supposed to talk about it. because you might because from in terms of what they've been told and their belief system, ETs are not here. There's no ETs here. Everything you see is us. It's all secret prototypes that basically the air forces of the world are developing in secret. And so if you see something, it's probably one of ours in terms of being human. And so their job is it's kind of like what Solar Warden does, but Solar Warden is a Navy faction, and that's why they have. So they're affiliated with the Off-World Space Navy, and that's a different faction. So this faction I'm referring to, the regular Air Force guys, they're right now, because of all the information that's come out, and especially like with your channel and other channels, all this information, it's coming out that the guys in terms of the regular Air Force military guys, even they're starting to question what they've been told because all this information is coming out, and so they're trying to play catch up. And what's been happening is there's some infighting going on with that group, and a rogue faction of it has actually been abducting people who they think were abducted by the SSP. So they're going back and abducting SSP experiencers and basically interrogating them, trying to find out is this screen memories, or is this like were they really in contact with ETs? So this gentleman in Australia, he's been talking with myself, he's been talking with Elena as well through private message, and he has a ton of information about this abduction experience he had. And so the reason I share it is because I think other people are having this experience too, where you're sleeping in bed at night and regular Air Force guys that have like the helmets and like they even have the goggles, like that visor that comes down, like they got the headsets, like they look like they just got off an aircraft. And they come into your room at night and they physically grab you and they give you an injection. And then you wake up, usually underground or on a craft. They do have stealth craft, and you get interrogated. But it's a drug-induced kind of situation where maybe they gave you scopolamine or just they dose you in some way so that you're just very complacent. And actually, what they do is they don't even really talk to you. They literally show you pictures. They will literally they have people of interest, and they will show you stuff on a screen, and they gauge your reaction based on the visual stimuli that they show you. They can gauge if you've seen that before. So it's not a regular interrogation when they're actually asking you a bunch of questions. They just abduct you, they inject you with the drug, they show you stuff, and just based on your facial reactions and your how your eyes look when you recognize something, they can tell like, okay, so that person has seen that before. So if they show them a small gray and they and that person reacts, or they show them a person of interest within the SSP who this Earth Defense Group thinks might actually be an asset, a high-ranking asset in the SSP, yeah, they'll show them that person and just gauge the reaction. So this has been going on quite a bit. Elena tried to, she did. She broke off all contact with the SSP in terms of the ICC group. She psychically made it very, very clear that she does not want any more contact. Like, leave me alone. I'm done. And since then, the ICC hasn't come back in terms of using her for active service. But what happened was she sent the intention out to one faction, and there's so many different factions that this other faction also abducted Elena, this lower level MIC group, and I think they took her to a cabin somewhere, and they did interrogate her. And but again, this is not Solar Warden, this is not ICC, this is not Darkfleet. This is this Air Force group. I think they're known as Earth Defense Force, possibly. I've been looking at Penny's posts recently, and I think she's starting to get into that.
Is that the faction. Same as the Alliance? The so-called Alliance? Yeah, is that different?
Actually, I asked the same question to Elena. I'm like, is Earth Defense the same as the Earth Alliance? And Elena's response was, no, Earth Defense is a different group. Sometimes they will work with the Earth Alliance, some of the time, if need be. But this, basically, this Earth Defense group, they kind of seem to be out of the loop. They're like the last guys to know, and because they were really just regular Air Force. And I mean, I think what happens is it's a good recruiting place. I think a lot of their personnel have been recruited into the secret space program and kind of left their colleagues behind. And now this Air Force group is trying to figure out like what's going on here. Like I think something is happening in terms of the Navy. And they're trying to figure out what the Navy's been up to. And then they're starting to put it together that the Navy actually does have a secret space program. And they're starting to put it together that there might really be a Fourth Reich Nazi aspect out there. And so these Earth Defense is trying to play catch up. But what they're doing it in a way where they're so desperate for intel, they're actually grabbing people physically. And that's what's been happening. And this gentleman, he had some missing time. He showed me a picture on his phone. He had some missing time, and he had injection marks. And it seemed like a very physical abduction experience, opposed to soul catcher technology, where you have an out-of-body experience, you're astral projecting in another reality almost, and then you wake up in your bed, and there's no real evidence that someone has entered your home physically, right? So I thought I should end it there. Just people be aware of the fact that in terms of the abduction thing, there are abductions going on in terms of the lower level Air Force right now, and they're just trying to play catch up because there's people on the internet who seem to know more than they do. So they're like, "What's going on here?" So they're just playing catch up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually what I've been told. Various CIA, NSA groups, they don't even know what's going on. Sometimes these organizations make comments on my videos. And they're just really low level peons in this whole apparatus. So with that said, I do want to mention that why doesn't the Earth Defense Force or the Earth Alliance, if they really want to defend the Earth, why aren't they releasing these exotic technologies such as free energy? Why maybe teleportation or even the quantum 3D printing that can print food out of thin air? What's your thoughts on that?
Like why they haven't released it to like the masses?
The general public. Yeah.
They are really trying to drag out the old paradigm. They don't want to give up that old paradigm. I know it's so overdue. I mean, most people who already know about this stuff that are waking up have come across free energy and are becoming very self-sufficient, just even in their own right. And they're kind of wondering, like, they feel like they're ahead of their time. But that's because the group that's in control of the surface, they really want to maintain the status quo. But what's interesting is the Rothschilds have sold off some of their oil shares, like their stocks in petrol. They've actually sold some of that off, if you look at it, and have started investing in renewable energy sources in terms of their own shares. So that means that if they're actually starting to invest in these newer energies and renewable energy, then usually the Rothschilds, they seem to be about 20 years ahead of everybody in terms of their investment portfolio. So they're already, if you look at it, they're trying to get their money out of oil, and they're actually starting to invest in alternative energy sources. So it is coming. But it's going to trickle out, and I don't think we're going to see this technology in terms of freer energy, like a hybrid car. I wouldn't say that's free energy. I would say that's a step in the right direction, freer energy. So they're going to do it in steps, and they're going to try to milk us the entire time just to drag it out. We'll have to probably drive hybrid cars, which is half petrol, half electric, for 50 more years. And it's like, I mean, we can have an electric car right now. Tesla's already doing that, but you'll still see hybrid cars that will use gas for 50 more years. Until the Rothschilds can switch over their investments and pull their money slowly out of oil and get as much as they can from that, and then in the background slowly transfer their assets over to renewable energy. So then once we get to that point as a society where we switch over completely to electric, they're going to own that as well, and then they're going to keep that going for a while, because I think even electric, there's probably some free energy, very advanced free energy devices that are even beyond the electric car using regular batteries. So, but that is the next step, just the electric car, which is pretty outdated even now, really, compared to what they have, right?
Yeah, right. Like in the other parallel reality where the Nazis won World War II, everybody drives primarily Mercedes and Beamers. And there's a car over there that only costs about $5,000, equivalent to our exchange rate in the United States. And the car the battery lasts 10 years, and it doesn't have to get recharged. So, well, once every 10 years. But yeah, so there is that technology available. but the powers that be just don't want to relinquish control. So unless there's some kind of massive upheaval in society, it appears we're going to keep going at this trajectory. But thankfully, we have whistleblowers such as yourself, Kevan, and others as well that have come forward to enlighten us about the way the universe actually is, and maybe we can actually make changes in our reality with this information. Although I highly doubt it, and most people are so low consciousness, it's almost kind of pointless even educating them. But we are doing our best. So I do want to ask, do you have a website or a book you would want people to read? A book that you've written, or go ahead.
No, I do have my timeline. I have a journal. I've been journaling all this stuff. So, I mean, the potential at some point, maybe I could make that available as a book. But if I ever write a book, I want to do an online PDF format and just make my experiences available for free and not actually print out a book or anything, or I would do an online open source PDF kind of thing. But no, I just journal. And I don't have a website. And in terms of my Facebook, I'm a fairly private person. I think I have like 47 friends on my Facebook right now. And that's after I came forward. So people can always add me on Facebook. And if you'd like to message me through private message and you'd like to ask me some questions or share your experiences with me to get a little bit of feedback, I'm totally open to that. I've actually enjoyed connecting with people on Facebook. And I'm pretty good at gauging people, and I can tell just by the way people phrase things or talk to me. I can tell, if you're an experiencer, a fellow experiencer, and you're just looking for some insights and you want someone to talk to, I'm that person. But I'm not saying that like add me on Facebook and we'll have a debate. That's not what I'm saying. I'm there to support others like myself. And so if you want to add me on Facebook, and send me a message. I will reply at some point.
Now, can you confirm if the Earth is flat or not?
Well, hey, you know what? Just from my recall, flying at high altitude, I do have memories of flying in the Arctic at night, high altitude, and the aurora. You got the aurora borealis, and it, it's all lit up, and you could see the curvature of the Earth, like even within that, and then you get at a high enough altitude, and you look down, and even then you see like the curvature of the Earth. I mean, I think most people who've been on an airplane, like at like 36,000 feet, can start to see that curvature of the Earth. So just from what I remember flying at high altitudes and back and forth between the LOC, I saw the curvature of the Earth.
That sounds like another psyops. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it seems like a psyop. I think just in closing, I think what they're trying to do with the flat Earth stuff, because I think interwoven into the flat Earth stuff, there's a lot of good information about Antarctica, actually. But then they throw in the kind of like the outdated Norse legend of like this ice wall surrounding us, and the Antarctica is like 360 around us, and at least how I understand it, it's like you got the flat Earth, and then Antarctica goes all the way around it, like some kind of border or something, and it is actually flat. And I think that is like a psyop to cover up the fact, so that even if you really research Antarctica and what that is, if you're a flat earther, in the same breath, you talk about Antarctica, and then you're also saying the Earth is flat. So you just lose all credibility, because anyone who's a pilot or has flown just even in a commercial airplane, you see the curvature of the Earth. It is a sphere. It may not be a perfect sphere, but it's a spherical shaped object. And so I think they're trying to cover up Antarctica because a lot of the flat earthers do talk. They have some great information about Antarctica. So,
thank you, Kevan. All right, so for listeners, if you have any other questions for Kevan, be sure to ask them. I know I want to explore more about Lunar Operations Command, because I know we didn't even hardly talk about that, and we didn't even talk about any of your experiences on Mars. And I'm sure you probably have some other experiences off-world as well, as what life is like, maybe who you met. Maybe did you ever happen to recall seeing me up there?
No, I have to say, unfortunately, I don't recall seeing you. This that's actually something a lot of people ask. They'll ask each other like, "Oh, do you remember me?" Or something. And it's like, well, this program, there's thousands of people involved, and if not millions of people over the years. So we're dealing with a lot of different programs that are running, and that's why, in terms of like the cloning and time travel thing, it can happen in a number of ways. And so, don't get hung up on if someone says it's this way or that way, and you know that you experienced something else because you probably did, because you were probably involved in a different project or program. And so you really got to identify with your own truth. And when you watch videos like this, if something resonates and you're able to pull information that actually serves you and helps you, that's great. But for whatever reason, if something doesn't resonate, then just move on. And I'm sure you'll find another person that does have a testimony that's exactly what you experienced. And then you can pull from that.
That's right, for sure. Definitely. And also I'd like to explore maybe some more of any of your other super soldier. Oh, I guess you didn't have any super soldier missions, but if you recall any other activities like that with Kruger or so on. But so there you have it. Once again, thank you, listeners, and thank you, Kevan. And be sure to visit supersoldiertalk.com. And until next time, bye-bye. Please consider supporting Super Soldier Talk by purchasing your own Neo Meditation device. Your Neo Meditation device will help you reduce stress, integrate trauma, enhance intuition, enhance clairvoyance, and enhance creativity. Get yours now at www.neologicaltech.com.